Last night, I dreamt I went to Chinatown Fair again.
Chinatown, it is a little small town in the middle of New York City. And dead center in the middle of that was Chinatown Fair.
Chinatown Fair was the last arcade in Manhattan, the last.
I never stepped in the arcade before. I saw an arcade in the dream.
They kind of captured that old New York feel, which was basically grime. I'm born into that. It was not a problem for me at all. I liked it.
I didn't care if there was like pimps and prostitutes and drug dealers. I had my games there.
People coming from everywhere and anywhere. This was the place to be.
The legendary dancing chicken was there then.
It was the allure of the sounds and the flashing screen. Everyone's shaking their bodies, they're sweating. I was like, what's going on here?
I ran away from a foster home. In the daytime, I would go on the train and sweep. But at night, the arcade. For as long as I had been there had been rumors that CF is gonna close down.
Thank you, CF, for the past 30 years, man.
You'll never have that experience of a pat on the back, respect. You'll never get that anymore.
I don't want to sign a gate. To me, that would be me saying, okay, I'm done. I'm not gonna do that.
If I had to open an arcade, I'll do it. Whatever it takes, I'll do it.
Your name and the station. You get those things right, you'll have no problem.
Everybody had a certain group in there. There would be a top player, a fashionable dude, a beautiful girl. You know, that's how it was.
As long as there's another opponent that wants to play, I'll play with them. That's all that matters.
So what is going on, everybody out there? Hopefully you guys have been enjoying UPLINK thus far. Again, we got another great panel for you going on throughout the day and stuff, and hopefully you guys are looking forward to this one because we're going to talk about a lot of fun stuff, okay? If you didn't already know, I'm Jakejames Lugo. I'm one of the hosts here for UPLINK throughout most of the entire event. Been already doing a bunch of panels throughout the day, but here's another great one that I get to be a part of. We're going to talk about the Lost Arcade documentary. Again, we're going to talk about arcade culture. We're going to talk about fighting game culture. We're going to talk about our classic retro gaming culture, a whole bunch of stuff in relation to this documentary. If you haven't already seen it, I highly recommend that you guys check it out. I believe it's on Amazon Prime, correct? Amazon Prime currently right now, which is dope. But I got a bunch of great guests with me to talk about the documentary and to talk about all this stuff that's brought up within it. I have the director of the documentary. We got Vincent, as well as also the writer and producer, Irene. So guys, welcome. Nice to meet you finally in person, which is nice.
Thank you.
Appreciate you both. Again, we'll get some more of your stuff in just a bit. And also I have my friend ScarletSprites that we've worked together before. We're UPLINK alumni, which is dope. And we got to work together on some recent stuff, but you get to be part of this with me. So how you been? You good?
I'm great. I'm like a fly on the wall here. Like I feel like I tricked somebody into letting me co-moderate this panel because I would just be in here watching and trying to ask questions. But you know, I got a front row seat for free.
So yeah, no, it's all good. You're gonna be part of this convo, okay? Because again, like I said, documentary is great. Again, you love arcade gaming, you know, classic arcade gaming. So this is right up your alley. And then between that and then my love of the FGC and you know fighting game culture, it just blends together so well. Which is what you get some at least in different parts in this documentary. So Kurt, Irene, let's talk about it. Like, you know, there's a lot of cool stuff that comes out of this. I mean, the Lost Arcade, it's been around already for over about 5 years now. At this point, it's been, people have checked it out. Some of the people that have been inside of it or a part of it, you know, that show up in the documentary, I'm pretty sure like things have changed for a lot of them, which is pretty crazy. I mean, what has been the reception or what has it been like, you know, after all these years since the documentary came out? I mean, you still get like feedback about it? Do you guys get reactions about it? What's up with that?
Yeah, that's the beautiful thing. You know, once you make it, you put it out in the world, and then it's no longer yours. And it's been a really amazing thing to just sort of see it become this sort of cult film that's really important to some people. I'm not saying it's like a huge film, but to a certain number of people, it's a really important thing, and it pops up on our radar. For example, just last week, this guy on Twitter, he's an artist who's got like a really popular Twitter, is at Baccoon. I'll throw it in the chat. you know, he's got a ton of followers and a lot of cool people, and he did a live stream of the documentary on Twitch this week, and it's like, you know, it's and that's introducing it to a whole new group of people that didn't come to it on their own before that. So it's cool, and yeah, you know, obviously the story's changed, the arcade has evolved since we made the movie, but the story, I think the way we made it, it's a timeless story, so it continues to have life.
Cool. Now, Irene, when you guys started taking on, you know, making the documentary back then, I mean, were you guys really exposed to a lot of like arcade culture, or even, you know, again, I say the fighting game culture because there's a lot of like FGC stuff there, a lot of history for the FGC within Chinatown Fair, you know, which is a big deal to a lot of people. So, but I mean, were you guys immersed in that prior to taking on the project?
Not at all. And we just happened upon the arcade randomly one night, and we had heard about it because we had read an article in the New York Times or something about this old school arcade in New York, and we were randomly walking around Chinatown one night. I remember it was like a really cold winter night, and it's like all the way down on Mott Street where like there's nothing open late at night, and it was like around midnight or something, and we just see this like glowing, like warm storefront. We're like, what is that? And like people hanging out on like a freezing winter night, and we're like, so we like go and check it out. We're like, oh my god, it's like the Chinatown Fair Arcade. And we walk in and we're like just hit with this amazing atmosphere, basically, that just really was the spark for the film and was the inspiration.
Yeah, it was Street Fighter 4. That was like Street Fighter.
That was when Street Fighter 4 was like brand new. That was like when it was fresh.
Yeah, it was fresh, and that was sort of what we walked into without knowing what the hell was going on. It was basically a Friday night, New York City, Street Fighter 4. That, you know, Henry built, what was it, 4?
Yeah, he had 4
cabinets, right? That we see in the dock.
Yeah, so two Japanese style sit down cabinets, and it was just like, it inspired us to make the movie, and then we learned, and we met a lot of the fighting game people, and they kind of schooled us on the whole scene.
Now, what's interesting, because before I go over to Joe, I want to touch on one more thing. I mean, you know, you kind of segued right into it, you know, your first experience with Chinatown Fair, which, again, being someone who grew up in New York, I never really got to go to Chinatown Fair, but I always knew about it around that area. I lived in New York for about over 20 years and stuff, and like a lot of the big spots, especially when you're into this type of culture, you know, you get word of mouth all over the place and stuff, especially when you're connected to the city like that, whether it's, you know, the Bronx, whether it's Manhattan, Queens, etc. You know, how has your impression of Chinatown Fair, or at least, you know, your reflection on that experience changed over time between the both of you? Because obviously, you know, like you say, you know, you got this atmosphere that was like a big inspiration for creating the documentary, and which I'm guessing was like phenomenal in the moment like that. But now looking back at it, I mean, have your thoughts or maybe your different types of perspectives have changed?
A
little bit.
What do you mean? Like, what do you mean? Like the way
do you look back on it a little bit more fondly, or maybe like you interpret things or see things a little bit differently? Because I mean, obviously 5 years have passed since you've had that first experience of like, you know, seeing Chinatown Fair in the way that you did, you know, to spawn, you know, making the documentary.
I mean, one thing that comes to mind is that, you know, Chinatown Fair, we started documenting it literally the last week that it was opened. And so it was the end of a chapter in the arcade, and I think now that we have some time, and it was sort of like the new version of Chinatown Fair that ends up opening up that we document in the movie. You know, they transformed it, and it was a lot to swallow for us, and also the people that were the community that loved the old arcade. The new one was not theirs, and I think we looked at that as a negative thing, and it's sad. But now I'm looking at it with like a step back, and I see that like that arcade has gone through that multiple times. So like Chinatown Fair used to be across the street at Port Arthur. It opened in the 1940s, you know, and at some point it moved across the street. I mean, so it's like this cycle, you know, and every time someone new takes over or a new manager comes in, shout out to Leo who came in after the reopening and really made it a safe place for a new group of people. So it's less like, I think I don't feel like it's a bad thing. It's just a sort of inevitable progression. And I'm just glad that someone in a community is still able to call it home, even though it's not, you know, Anthony and Akuma's and the guys in the movie. It's not their home anymore, but I understand that more so now.
And do you feel similar a little bit about it, Irene, as well? You know, in some way?
Yeah. Yeah, Kurt said that pretty well. I don't know. Yeah. The arcade lives on.
Cool.
That's
and that is the theme of the movie,
and that's
right?
Yeah, and it's about community. And so that's really, it's about the people, and that's what we discovered, because we're like, oh, this is an amazing place, but what made it special was the community and the people that were there. And those were the people that like totally welcomed us, and they were like so psyched to tell their story and the story of the arcade. And so like, yeah, I mean, that's, yeah, it's about community and people and people together.
Yeah,
and strength communities. Yeah. So yeah.
Gotcha. Now I want to come back to that in just a bit, but let me go over to Joe and ask Joe, like, what was your first impression after seeing the documentary? You know, again, when you got a chance to sit down and watch it and stuff. Again, I don't know if you've ever been to New York in that scene or got a chance to visit Chinatown Arcade at any point, but tell me a little bit about some of your impressions.
Yeah, I've never been to the actual arcade. Now, I did go to college on Long Island, so I had been out to the city a few times. I was very familiar with the area and you know, its reputation and whatnot. And that would have been the late 90s, early 2000s. So I'm very familiar with the vibe, right, of what was going on in that area. Yeah. So, you know, I think one of the things, you know, it's a lot to unpack here as far as, you know, how I felt overall about the film. But, you know, I will say that early on, I think what was captured for me watching it was, I know we're talking about the Chinatown Arcade, a specific arcade, but I think anyone who lived in that era, who went to arcades, had a similar type experience where you could relate to what Irene and Kurt were just saying about the community. You would go to these venues and maybe you didn't know everybody there, but you recognize people. And it's like, oh, there's that guy. He's on Mortal Kombat again, you know, and he's playing that machine. And sometimes you did strike up conversations. And, you know, internet wasn't as, you know, and social media wasn't the way it is today. And so, you know, you're kind of like living in this pocket of your own high school or whatnot, right? And then here's a way to interact with other rival schools and whatnot. Because before that, it's like it's football games and it's that kind of stuff. But here, everybody, you know, because arcades, you know, kind of were wherever, at the mall or a standalone at a strip mall or wherever, and you got these different groups of people, teenagers kind of converging, and it's like, oh, they like the same kind of things I do, and you have these common things that you guys do and competitions too, you know, who can beat who on what machine, and that gets ramped up. Sometimes it's a healthy competition, sometimes not so much. But I think that's what at least the first part of the film did for me. It was just kind of rekindling that whole, like, I remember this, I remember the feeling, I remember being there, I remember, you know, not Chinatown, but I had my, and I think a lot of people could probably relate.
True. Very, very true. I definitely agree. Let me ask you this before we move on to a little bit more specific stuff about the film. You know, do you feel like, again, with so many things have changed up, obviously, for the arcade scene, arcades for most of the part here in the United States are kind of dead, or at least they're gone or extinct to a point where they've really, you know, because of the financial burden, you know, of like running an actual arcade, but also just the changing of the landscape with gaming as a whole in the industry itself. I mean, for me personally, I see that same vibe and that same type of experience, or at least that amount of fun that you got from going to an arcade, I think has evolved into gaming lounges, or at least evolved into places like, you know, you get like those Dave and Buster's types of experiences, the Boomers and stuff. But I think it's much more rather than just that, because they obviously have the arcade machines. But I think like going to like a LAN lounge or a LAN, you know, cafe or a gaming lounge where it's like, okay, you got like your console games, your arcade games and other stuff, but you're still getting that experience of going to a spot, meeting people, or maybe meeting them again multiple times over a period of time like that. Do you feel like at least that's where that spirit of like what you got at like a Chinatown Fair has really kind of transferred over to, at least in the modern day now?
Mm-hmm.
Is it? Is that for Kurt or for me?
No,
Sorry.
that's for you. That's for you, Joe. No,
Okay, all right.
Joe.
No, yeah. It's funny because I was thinking about that a little bit while watching like what's different today. I think the difference with like a Dave and Buster's type thing is it's an event. Like families will go there, or you go there with your friends, you have dinner, and then it's like a one time a month maybe type of thing. Where as the arcade itself, like you go there on the weekend. Like I said, it's in the mall. Like a couple of the arcades I used to hit as a kid were in the, and so that's where you hung out, and you everybody was there on the weekend, right? And so you go in and you saw these people. That's where the community was really built. I think that's the difference today, is that a lot of the arcades are the type of venues that exist today. It's not the same people. You can't wander into a Dave and Buster's and expect to see the same people, your friends and whatnot, the way you used to. I think what you referenced as far as the lounges, it's probably the closest thing that we have today, and but it's still not quite the same in my opinion.
I agree. I think there's a lot of differences in it. I think obviously, besides the money that one would pay to go to something like that, because remember, going to an arcade, like you only needed a quarter to play on the machine like that, or you get like a couple bucks, you get a bunch of quarters, you're playing on a bunch of machines. Now you pay $10 all day to go play on console games online against other people locally. So there's a lot of changes there, but I still feel like there's still like an element of that experience.
There's an element. Yep.
Yeah. That's something close to that. So Kurt and Irene, let me ask you this, while you guys were making the film and, you were going together and hearing a lot of these stories and stuff, did you expect like some of the types of stories or some of the types of individuals that you met, along the way while you were filming all this stuff and talking to a lot of these people? Because I mean, I don't remember necessarily specific names, but I remember there was, the guy who got a job at the arcade at one point, that was young, that he ended up working there after going so much. There was also the guy that he did a bunch of stuff, but he went to go found Next Level, the other type of like lounges. So I think it was in a different location at some point, where you could start to see these little pockets and these little stories while, being part of this location. I mean, did you guys expect something like that, or did you guys foresee that coming down the line, or?
No, I mean, I think we had a feeling that there was a really important human side to the arcade, but we had no idea that we would meet people that had such profoundly important experiences at Chinatown Fair, where, Sam, the old owner, was a surrogate father for a lot of the young people there. And honestly, like, we could have told 100 more stories. There were so many different people had life-changing experiences at the arcade. So we were surprised. I was surprised. Were you?
Yes.
Yes.
Like, we met a couple that ended up getting married, and they met like playing DDR at Chinatown Fair.
That's cute.
Like in the 90s.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, crazy life-changing stories, and we went in just thinking we were gonna document. We had a feeling that like, oh, this is a really important place, and we should document the closing of it because somebody should do that.
Because it was so unique. Because it was like, because we grew up in the 80s and 90s, and we, it was so rare at that point. What, in 2010 when we started filming, or 2011, it was like there were no arcades pretty much like this one, and so we kind of looked at it like it was the last of its kind, even though it's not, but it might as well have been.
Yeah.
And so we were like, let's just film this and see what happens, and we were just blown away at what we found.
Interesting. So I want to segue into this. That's a good offshoot of that. Why do you think like this arcade specifically felt like, they had to deal with so much adversity? Because there was a lot of different things that you showed in the film that, the arcade was going through, besides the financial stuff, coming to terms with change. I remember there's one moment where when they shuttered up and they had all the people like drawing stuff on there or like marking off on the actual shutters, saying a whole bunch of different stuff. Some people were angry. They were trying to, they were kind of like projecting their anger on it a little bit. It was like, why is this happening? Or why is this changing up and stuff? I mean, why do you think this particular arcade, like, really had so much of that going on for it?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I think the fighting game community is very
very
spirited. And there's a lot of, like,
passion.
Yeah, passion, friendships, but, like, beef, too. Like, people were, like, there was a lot of, like, drama, but no, I mean more so there's like family. I mean like
so it had the community, so it had the it had the players, it had the people with fiery personalities and passion for this place, but and then plus you had those people were coming from one of the most the most populated cities in America, so you had people from, and at that point all the arcades in Times Square, Harlem, all of those places had closed. So you basically had people from all the boroughs coming to this place. So it had a very healthy, a
lot of legends in the fighting game community. I know that got their start there.
Yeah, and then the owner Sam was the perfect owner for that place because he was so chill and very open-minded and just let people be themselves and kind of was like the cool guy. Like he was great and he respected the kids, and so the kids respected him. And then so that created an atmosphere that was very conducive to a healthy community. And it became like any sort of community space, it became important to those that found it.
True. Joe, let me ask you this, because again, me and you, we worked on stuff before. We did a review together as a collab, for a fighting game. And one of the things that was good for me and you was that you don't you're not deep into the fighting game scene. You're not part of that environment like that. Did you feel like when watching this documentary, did you get a little bit much more insight or a window into that part of that culture like that? Because there's a lot of stuff even that I was recognizing, a lot of people that I've seen within the fighting game scene on the come up or end up becoming important individuals or figureheads at one point. Or at least did you get that essence at least when you were watching it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I wasn't surprised at all to learn that there were these like you were talking. I think the film talks about the shooter crowd being in there, right? And then you've got your DDR type people. You've got and there's bleed over, the fighting game community, and people will play different types of games. But I wasn't at all surprised to see that. I think falling back on my own personal history. So, I shared with you guys before we started here, I'm in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I grew up in a small town outside of Harrisburg here. It's one thing to be good at something in a small town back then, right? Because you're not playing online. There's no gaming online. You can beat your friends and, a handful of other people. Then when I went to college in New York and discovered, well, there's people that are really good at these types of
humbled.
Yeah. And so even just playing in dorms and whatnot, and then getting out and seeing, what was left of arcades in the late 90s on Long Island and New York. Wow, this is where the hardcore people go. And these people are really good. I mean, it's very humbling. It was a humbling experience for me. So that was definitely, I think that was definitely conveyed via the documentary, for sure.
Definitely. Now, Kurt, Irene, I want to ask you guys this because Joe just mentioned it, and you guys talked about it a little bit before. Besides the fighting game crowd, which was obviously a big part of Chinatown Fair and what you guys showed in the doc, but you also mentioned the DDR crowd, some of the other types of gamers that ended up going there, which not a huge part of the documentary from what I saw, but it's still there. It's still prevalent because obviously there's different types of gamers all over the place. And what stood out to me is with the DDR crowd is that it's almost like a different type of, not attitude, but a different type of vibe that you get from those types of players. Like with the DDR crowd, I mean, they're still friendly, they're still cool, and everybody's, more chill and stuff, but they're playing a much more physical game. Much credit to the DDR crowd with what they do. They're insane sometimes. I mean, when you guys were filming stuff and you saw all this stuff playing out in real time, did you expect different pockets of types of gamers, to be kind of present there or represented in some way? Or were you actively trying to go out and try to find other stuff than what was probably the more dominant thing at the time?
We just went with the flow, and I totally agree. I think the rhythm gaming community did have a very different vibe than the fighting game community, and there is bleed over. But people when you go watch DDR, I mean, everybody's rooting for each other, gassing each other up, and it's a little more macho. I mean, I have to say with the fighting game community, there's a little more locker room bravado kind of vibe, and there's way less chicks that play it, at least at Chinatown Fair, which was kind of a nice thing in the new Chinatown Fair. It was a more rhythm gaming friendly community there, or it was a bigger community, so it became a little more friendly to women, which was nice. But that old Chinatown Fair, it was like fighting games was
the jam, literally.
Yeah.
If you take out the fighting games, you're left with nothing there.
It's funny you bring that up because I want to dive into that a little bit because I saw someone asking a question about it. It's like when that change happened and you show it in the film, like the vibe changed. It became a little bit much more carnival-like, kind of like how it was in the older days prior to all that stuff happening with the arcade scene with the FGC and stuff. There was definitely a different vibe completely. I mean, when you guys saw that happen, you were documenting it. I mean, did you guys feel a certain way about it? Did you guys feel things were like changing maybe for the better or for worse at all?
Yeah, I mean, here's the deal. Like, the old Chinatown Fair had a vibe. I mean, it was, people smoking blunts, drinking 40s. Sam at that point was very relaxed. He was the owner. And as long as he didn't, mess with anyone, we never saw any violence. I mean, there was, you get a bunch of teenagers together, there's going to be fights. But, for the most part, it was a safe place. For me, being a dude, and we heard from a lot of young women that did not feel comfortable there, though. But at the time, we weren't really thinking about that. And when we saw the transformation occur, they paint. Henry always painted the walls. Henry was the manager. He grew up going to the arcade fighting. He's the father figure. He's now the father figure in the fighting game community in New York in a way. He always painted the walls dark red, and it had that vibe. It was dark. It was late night vibes, and then and then painted it pastel colors, and it was just, it felt wrong.
Yeah.
But since then, those colors have faded, and graffiti has popped up, and it's gotten that grit back, and that feels good. It needs to be gritty because I think you got to feel comfortable. If you spill your drink, you don't want to feel like you're in trouble there. It's and I feel like it's kind of like that again. It's a little dirty again. But I'm super stoked that it is way more friendly to females and potentially even other marginalized groups.
Yeah. What do you think about that, Irene? I mean, do you have a similar opinion, or did you get any other perspective, about any of that?
Yeah, I think we originally, when we were first filming the new opening of the Chinatown Fair, the new pastel Chinatown Fair, we were like, oh God, this is a disaster. This is horrible. Connie literally said, I want it to be a little Dave & Buster's. And we're like, what? That's just crapping on, what Chinatown Fair was, what made it so amazing. And so we kind of went in being very suspicious of this guy and his intentions. And, that's just so funny because he tried to force these this Dave & Buster's type place, and it failed. And what saved it was the rhythm gamers that just naturally would start coming. The community naturally grew over time and saved the arcade base.
Because rhythm gamers, you can't do that at home. I mean, you need that physical.
Yeah.
You can't do it as much at home because obviously now we got DDR pads and stuff with the consoles and stuff. But back then, I know you had to go to that machine, just to experience that.
Re-Rave was the new game at that moment that there wasn't even a home version, and so that kind of hit just like that. Look at the history of arcades. It's every time the arcade industry is dipping, some developer publishing company comes out with a new title and kind of sparks a whole new growth of arcades. And I was just I saw that Re-Rave came from an independent studio, I think.
New Jersey.
And it just saved Chinatown Fair. And I was like, man, we need more companies to make games for the arcade setting because the arcade industry is failing, but part of it's because no one's making the games for the arcade.
Yeah, tech was changing. Tech was definitely changing. And again, you touch on it in the doc a little bit, not in depth, because I've seen other docs that have gone more into detail and stuff about how the technology, going from arcade gaming to console home gaming really changed up the landscape big time for a lot. Because again, gave gaming access or gave access to a lot of people that weren't as invested in that scene as opposed to other, types of stuff that happened later on eventually and stuff. It was really interesting to see that. Before we continue on, I want to ask Joe, because that type of stuff, when things changed up, it was a hard change for Chinatown Fair. You got that vividly from the actual documentary. I mean, what were your thoughts when you saw it? Because I know when I saw it, I was like, yeah, like nobody in the FGC that was going there like hardcore is going to like this. And you could see it from the people, like when Kurt and Irene were talking to them, or at least they were telling their stories. Like it's like palpable, like that kind of like, frustration a little bit, it felt.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's pretty common amongst people who are probably remember the old arcade and are our age and whatnot. I think that's pretty common. Do we need another Dave and Buster's? Like, that's not, we kind of already talked about that a little bit, about what a Dave and Buster's and those types of venues are. They're different, and you didn't always go to the arcade just to play games, which we've also, kind of talked about here. It's a community. You're building relationships, and you're challenging yourself against, top level players, be it in a DDR type game or a fighting game. And again, the whole Dave and Buster's experience, are you going to walk in there and find somebody that's, a top tier player just going, it's just not the same. And I think when you see something that transforms into something you love, that transforms into the direction everything else is going, it's probably natural to have that letdown. You're feeling like, the machines are the same, but what you've created from an atmosphere and environment, it's not.
So let me ask you this, Kurt and Irene. I mean, when that change did happen, and you were talking to the new owner when he came in, and he was like making all these changes and stuff, did you feel like he was doing that because he was making changes based off of what he knew worked elsewhere and wasn't really paying attention to the environment itself? Because I feel like, again, from watching it, like he was knowledgeable about arcades and just the arcade machines, like as a business side of things. I don't think he really understood the social aspect, the social impact within that location, because I don't think he really experienced that elsewhere when he was bringing his experience with them. Do you feel like, because I don't think he was doing it like malicious. I don't think you guys present it like that. I think you guys present it nicely and fairly from what his perspective was. But like, do you feel like maybe it's because he just didn't take enough time to sit down and really understand the location, like the environment of it, and that's why things ended up the way they did?
I think you nailed it. I think Lonnie, Lonnie's a cool guy. He loves arcades, not because he's a hardcore gamer, but he just I think he's like a big kid at heart. And he has a place out in Jersey, like out in a smaller town, and it very much was a family. It wasn't a Dave and Buster's. It was way more old school than that. But they had a lot of redemption games and a lot of birthday parties. And I think that's how they kept the doors open. And he thought he could just do that same thing in the heart of Chinatown, in Chinatown Fair. And it's like, no, man, like it wasn't going to work. And, good for him. Like he saw he saw the writing on the wall, and, luckily, he kept on putting in more competitive games, mostly rhythm, but also some racing games and a few shooters and some Japanese titles. And he started getting like the teenagers coming, and that became, it actually it did really well. Like I was talking to him last year, well, actually 2019, and he was looking to expand. They were trying to figure out how to take over this other part of the building. I mean, that's crazy, right? Like, so cool.
I wanted to ask you, like, do you keep in contact with most of the people that were featured in the doc? Like, you talk to him, obviously. Do you talk to anybody else that ended up appearing in the doc?
Yeah, Anthony is still our dude. He's still in the village. We haven't talked to Akuma for a while, but we check in every once in a while. I mean, that's one thing we love about social media. It makes it so easy to just keep tabs on each other. But that's actually a good reminder. Like, I need to check in on some of these guys.
You gotta forget it. That just be like, hey, how's it going? But let me ask you this then, because we mentioned location before. Because Chinatown Fair, like I said, has a very special place for the fighting game community. It has a special place for New York gamers specifically. Like that's a thing, especially if you're into geek culture, into gaming culture and stuff. Do you feel like this type of stuff, what you did with this documentary, would have been as impactful or as relevant had it been any other location, like in another state or maybe another arcade that might maybe still had a name, but because this is Chinatown Fair, and it's like for certain people, like this has a resonance with them. Do you feel like the same type of vibe or the same type of reception would have been the same elsewhere?
I mean, we're talking about, it would be such an entirely different movie. and story, because it was like Chinatown Fair, while the essence of it is an arcade that could take place anywhere. The manifestation of it, the expression of that arcade is just so New York.
Yeah, that's true.
That one thing that really inspired us to make the film was the fact that when we were looking at the footage, like after the first shoot, we were blown away at how diverse the people were in one shot. You saw like Hispanic, white, black, Asian, everything in the mix, and we're just like, whoa, that's so rare anywhere. And that I think that's one beautiful thing about New York. It's just like it really still is the melting pot.
Facts.
That's hard to find in a lot of places.
That's facts. Do you feel the same way, Irene, in that way?
Yes, and also the fact that it had been an arcade since the 40s and always in Chinatown, always on Mott Street, just like buried down there in Chinatown. I mean, it's just, yeah. And it was just part of that neighborhood too, because everybody, even if you weren't a gamer, obviously you just lived in the neighborhood. That was like the spot. Like my dad is from Queens and he was like, oh yeah, we'd go to Chinatown, Manhattan Chinatown like once a month or whatever, and like he remembers going to the arcade like when his dad would go like do stuff and they would like go run into the arcade or whatever, but like everybody, I don't know, it was just it was
had a charm to it somewhat. Well, was there any other locations that maybe you could tell us that you probably looked at prior to that first day of shooting or prior to putting everything together that you were thinking about like maybe elsewhere of actually constructing stuff?
Not before shooting, but while we were making it, we did, really start researching the arcade business, and especially around New York. And, Coney Island, obviously, they still have an arcade. We went there and filmed some. We went to a few arcades in Jersey. And then, of course, we read about all the amazing arcades in Times Square. And we're just like,
so
wow.
Mostly like northeast area like that.
Yeah.
The reason why I asked is because obviously, like even back then, like arcade locations. So it states like obviously Florida's got a big retro gaming scene and stuff so I didn't know if like maybe you guys looked elsewhere to other states or stuff, prior to all that. Somewhat.
Yeah,
but,
not
yeah.
much. What?
Yeah. The reason why I was saying that is because again, with all the other like arcade scenes, I thought that maybe if this was like a specific Northeast type of thing that you guys were thinking about, or just arcade in general. So you maybe were looking national or anything of the sort. Did you guys ever consider that, or maybe not?
No, we really wanted to just tell the story of this one place, because we saw it sort of as like a metaphor for every other arcade. And it was just a really good version of that story.
Okay, cool. So let me ask you this then, Joe, because I think this is a perfect, offshoot of that. Seeing this documentary now and the way it was handled, telling this type of story, observing things through this type of lens for, arcade culture, just gaming culture back then. Do you feel like this would be a cool idea to kind of like apply to other types of aspects to arcade culture or gaming culture, or maybe another type of location? Like I know down here in Florida, perfect example is like that big location where Billy Mitchell made his his world records for like classic Pac-Man and like Donkey Kong and stuff. I know we have King of Kong, that's like a whole separate documentary, but like the location and just like looking at that stuff from like a different lens.
Yeah, I mean, possibly. I mean, I think in this specific scenario, like Kurt is saying, like you really told a story about something specific in a moment in time, and I think it would probably. I mean, Kurt's the filmmaker, but for me, like I would think it would probably take finding one of those types of moments and being able to kind of tell that type of story. I don't know that you could just walk into any random arcade and just hope to find something. I don't know. I mean, I'd let Kurt answer that actually.
Yeah, Kurt.
I do feel like there's a story. Like if you dig deep enough, you can find a story almost anywhere. I kind of believe that, but I haven't really paid attention, like, really recently to the arcade scene. Like, where, like, maybe you guys could talk a little bit about that in general. Like, where are things at right now? Well, pandemic's probably screwed things up, but
that's a good question. And I think that I could bring it up to you guys again, so to maybe think about. It's like, you know, either one. If like if you had the opportunity to do like a sequel to this, right, and you were gonna tell like, okay, whatever the next chapter, years now, it's been years since then, like how things have evolved, how things have changed. The way I would look at it, at least, you know, as a good starting point, is like, okay, arcades are pretty much gone at this point, but they've transferred it or turned into something else, or at least that same spirit has turned into something else, which would obviously be like the gaming lounges that I mentioned, as well as also taking gaming online at home like that. Because for the FGC now, that was like that's such a big part of Chinatown Fair. A lot of them now are at home playing online and getting ready for places like Evo, which is like the tournament scene and stuff. I feel like that would be like the natural progression or the next like stage of that, to look at it from that lens and see like, okay, has that stuff still stayed authentic, or that stuff is still kind of pervaded, you know, in spirit in some way while times are changing and stuff. I mean, how does that something, at least, you know, through your eyes, like if you had to like construct something like right now, would you kind of like have a little bit of that thought process, or maybe kind of, you know, process it that way?
well, first off, Evo, that would be an amazing movie. There is an Evo series or movie that's waiting to be made.
Yeah, true. That's true.
I went out there to follow the Chinatown Fair guys at Evo. None of that footage made the film, but it was and I think because it's a whole other thing. It was just like, that's a story that deserves told, and it's an amazingly powerful community. That was grassroots, and it's become something so big. I don't know, like I feel like this is kind of not answering your question, but I'm very interested. I don't think we're there yet, but I'm interested in seeing where virtual reality comes to fulfill the need to come together and play with people. And like, I look forward to, I'm not talking about the Ready Player One yet, but like, just like some sort of virtual arcade where people can hang out together and play. Like, I want to see what that looks like in the future.
Be kind of like a Disney Quest, a little bit like you're at home, but like you go to visit an arcade, which has all these games that like in the arcade scene like construct. That'd be kind of cool. It'd be kind of like a pseudo MMO type of thing, you know, but in virtual reality. That'd be kind of dope.
It'll happen. I think that'll be really cool. And then I think that might even lead to more real physical arcades. But it's going to be a subculture, and those places are going to be owned by very passionate gamers, kind of like the people that own record shops. It's like, yeah, they're doing it to make money, but they're not doing it to get rich. They're doing it because they love selling records, they love music, and they love the people that are attracted to that. It's like, I think there is going to continue to be arcades. Next Level, the one that Henry opened up in Brooklyn, he found you got to be able to evolve and adapt, and I think he saw that tabletop gaming could be a way to help keep his business open, and it's still the same thing essentially. It's like people coming together around a game, and I don't know, like there's definitely a lot of stories to tell about these places.
True. I agree. And I think it's also interesting about the tournament scene, like with Evo. I think also there's a lot, especially with the fighting game scene, when you get into that more, you get into more of the esports type of scene like that, beyond fighting games, when you start going to other crazier stuff, which I think could be told through, have a story told through a similar lens, just looking at different subject matter like that. I mean, do you feel the same, Joe? Or at least, maybe that something like that could possibly work if it's like another way of like telling this type of story, or another way of like, looking at the next chapter of this stuff.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think even just like the models that these places have to follow or try to adapt to in order to survive and be able to produce revenue to stay open is kind of interesting too. I mean, we've touched on it a little bit. I mean, I'm thinking more like right now, a lot of the better, well, a lot of the places that have the machines that I would be interested in, I'll say it that way, are like your barcade type, venues. And so I've seen them switch like their themes almost. Like during the day, they're advertising kids specials. So they're going heavy on family and trying to bring them in during the daylight hours. And then at night, we've got all these tournaments. We're going to have a leaderboard up. And so they're switching the audience that they're catering to. And I think that, that kind of stuff is interesting because they know they got to do that in order to pay the bills.
So let me go back to Kurt and Irene for a second. I mean, in the doc that you guys show, again, you show this a lot, between the DDR community or the rhythm community, the fighting game community, and even just some of the casual people. All those types of communities and types of gamers all live in unison. They live in coexistence practically in Chinatown Fair. Do you feel like that same type of environment, or at least that same type of, I guess you could say, happenstance or thing happening like that, could that be an occurrence here during today? Like, if there's like some other locations there, granted technology is different and there's different types of ways to play games. Do you feel like those types of crowds could coexist like that in that same way from what you guys saw firsthand?
I think so. It's just gonna probably look different. I mean, like Henry's arcade that he opened up in Brooklyn, Chinatown, it had a lot of that same, the essence of community and coming together and playing together. And people, I think, will always want to play games together. It's just a different experience. But yeah, I mean, that's just like, yeah, that's the question, I guess. It's a really interesting question that I don't know. I think we're all struggling with sort of. Probably, struggling with, just because it's like, it's just becoming so much harder to like go to an arcade with cabinets that are like decades old, and and I don't know, there's just, yeah.
Here's a different way I could ask this then that might be a little bit better, because I was just thinking about this now. What is one thing that you guys saw at Chinatown Fair that can never be reproduced at all? I think that being an aspect of it, like going to play on those types of machines like that. But what is one maybe intangible thing that you guys saw as you were making the documentary and shooting stuff that like was there in that moment, but like now these days people that are younger or have never been to that place will never experience?
I mean, I don't think there's an answer to that. To me, young people will always be able to experience what happened at Chinatown Fair, because I think that these kind of places will always exist. I think the desire to play with one another and do that by using video games is like, it's here for good, and I think the experience will look different, but I think it'll feel the same. And whether that's at like, a nonprofit community center in the basement of a church or a amusement park arcade, I think people will find it. I think it's gonna always be there.
True. I think I agree to an extent, because I feel like the one thing I don't think a lot of people now that are younger that didn't go to places like that or didn't grow up like that to attend arcades like that, I don't think that element of like having to compromise or having to kind of build your time around going to a place like that, I think that's maybe the one thing that probably won't ever be replicated for a certain generation or certain crowd. But I mean, again, there's so much that's changed where they could get that same type of stuff elsewhere or in a different way. Again, online gaming, gaming lounges, mobile games, just playing on your phone when you're just like riding the bus or riding the train or something. Like you can still get that similar experience, even though not the same type of games, but this type of like fun factor from it and kind of like linking up with different people. I mean, Joe, do you feel similar, or at least, or can you think of like one other thing after watching the documentary that's like one thing nothing will be replaced or at least reproduced, in this day and age?
It's this might not be the most eloquent way to say it, but I'm thinking about like, we talked about the violence aspect earlier, right? But that always kind of self-regulated itself, at least in the places that I went to, because you knew that if you said something, you might have to answer for it there or outside. So it kind of took care of itself almost organically. Whereas on the online community now, you say whatever you want and you don't really have to, you know what I mean? So you're in person kind of building those types of relationships and you want to interact one-on-one and be part of that community. You didn't say things like that. Like that wasn't how that community was built. Now, sometimes there's some friendly banter and sometimes, yes, there's a few bad actors, right? But that whole having to kind of compose yourself, and it's like, well, can I really beat this guy? Who's watching, right? Like, if I step up here to play this person, am I going to be embarrassed? You had to think about those kinds of things like that, because that was a real thing, and you were there on display in front of your friends or whoever else may have been there. That's a tough thing to replicate online.
You know, that brings up a funny point, and I'm curious between Kurt and Irene. Like, when you guys were shooting this, did you see any moments, or did you guys get close to any moments where maybe some things got a little bit too hot, or a little bit too kind of, you know, brazy, or like things got to a point where like you saw things unfold in the way that they unfolded? Because I can only imagine, like, when you're trying to film stuff where everybody's on their best behavior or trying to be in some way.
No, most of that stuff was just stories that we heard.
Yeah.
Some pretty graphic
some stories
of right. So, yeah.
Yeah. There was a story about somebody's ear getting.
Oh God.
Yeah, that was the most graphic story. It didn't make the film, but yeah, I mean, it got there were like bouncers too, basically. Like they would have guys just, I mean, not like bouncer, but like just to like make sure things were cool and that people were behaving and to take care of like fights, just, you know.
Yeah.
And that was a part of Chinatown Fair, but like, yeah, that was a part of Chinatown Fair.
Can I ask a question to Scarlett?
Sure.
Do you think this is, so I'm thinking about arcade type of games. They're very different than the kind of games that necessarily you play at home, because, you know, it's got the quarter economy. It's got to be like player versus player, ideally. But a lot of like the retro games that were made in the arcade days are being reissued now, or like you can play them on the Switch, or you can play them on, you know, all these different platforms. There's HD versions, and do you feel like this good historical work that these companies are doing, because, you know, it's like property and they're selling it again, do you think that is going to, you know, lead to young kids that, you know, were born in the 2000s discover that era of gaming and then seek, and like, do you think it might lead to a, you know, the arcade staying alive? Like, how's that going to impact it?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, I've thought about that myself, actually, and even thinking like taking a sidestep from that and looking at a lot of the indie developers that are pushing out games for like the Switch that have that retro look to them, and that's you know, I would think like maybe even like 10 years ago, people may have just panned that, but now it's like kind of a cool thing. It's the cool graphic style. It's like hand-drawn sprites and things like that. You know, that whole element of, I think what you were getting at, games being designed around, well, one, they have to be addictive because you want people to feed the quarters into it, right? It's got to last enough to kind of get them hooked, but not too long because you want them to put another quarter in and keep paying for the machine. But then there's the whole score chasing element, which I don't know. I mean, outside of certain groups of people and communities, that's not a big thing in the modern console. Like with your, you know, you're more geared towards completing a quest or a platform game, and a lot of games even advertise like, you know, this is like 50 or 60 hours to complete this, or, you know, a review will say that kind of stuff. Whereas you know, those types of games that you're referring to, Kurt, like could go on for forever. Like you know, it's constantly trying to, and I don't know. I don't have kids of my own. So I, you know, and I don't follow too much like into like what, you know, the younger kid outside like the Fortnite stuff, which I'm aware of, but, you know, but I don't know. I wonder if you are building that whole racing mentality again in a new type of population. It's a really interesting question. Does gaming, you know, not evolve but revolve, right? Come back around to where the roots are and, you know, were in the 80s. I don't know. I would love to think that that's happening and that you'll see that promote arcades in the future. But yeah, I don't know. It's a great question.
It's interesting stuff to think about. I feel like, again, you know, as things continue to change over the years and stuff like that, you're going to see stuff like that come back around, maybe presented in a different fashion. Because, like you mentioned, a lot of games get remade, a lot of games get re-released on collections. Like, I mean, we got the Capcom collection talked about not too long ago on a Nintendo Direct, which is a big deal. And then we had the Bandai Namco collection not too long ago, and, you know, the list goes on. So it's pretty cool, pretty neat to think about, especially with those games that weren't made with the intention of being released like that are now seen, presented in a different way and stuff. So we're going to wind things down now. We're kind of getting close to that time, but I want to know some closing remarks, from you. Let's start off with you, Joe. I mean, any other final thoughts about the Lost Arcade, about Chinatown Fair, the arcade gaming scene? Talk to me. What is like one thing or a few things that stand out to you?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think for me, watching it, especially like, the first half of the film, and just it just struck such a chord of remembering a time, back in the late 90s, mid 90s for myself, and the whole, again, the community aspect that we've talked about, challenging other players, going in and you watching, seeing somebody play on a machine and wondering if you could beat them, and thinking like, should I step up here and give this a shot? All of that I think was really conveyed. We talked about Street Fighter 4 a little bit, and watching the gentleman's name's escaping me, but watching him create that for the arcade, because I think he had to import from Japan and bring it over and set up the cabinets. But that's really, I thought you had touched on that point pretty well in the film, Kurt. Like that really seemed to be the thing. Like the new games are what brought people out to play and learn, experience, and kind of challenge other players. And then when that starts to go away, that was really an interesting point in the film, because I thought like there's somebody really going lengths in order to kind of it's a last gasp of air to try to this is an arcade game that I'm gonna make it be an arcade game, even if it's not, because that's what has made this survive for so long. It was almost heartbreaking in a way, kind of watching that. I really and knowing that really was probably like the last time somebody did something like that. Yeah. I mean, I loved it. I really loved watching the doc, and I'll probably watch it again here because we talked about it today. I'll probably go back and watch it tonight.
Yeah, for me, again, I had a lot of fun watching it. I was very nostalgic because not only it takes me back to where I used to live, in my home state of New York, and just it was just fun, seeing that stuff and knowing what I know now over the years, about the fighting game scene, seeing a lot of the origins and a lot of the beginnings for a lot of big players. I know Justin Wong used to talk about, he still does, where he goes to Chinatown Fair, where he used to go to Chinatown Fair all the time, especially with his beginnings at Street Fighter 4 before he became a big household name, besides that and Third Strike. And then some of the other cats that I know that lived up in New York that have vivid memories of going there and just being part of that scene and being part of like every weekend, just seeing stuff like that. A couple of names that come to mind with that I've seen them talk about. I think it was James Chen, I think it was Long Island Joe, and a few others that have been within that environment, playing Marvel vs. Capcom 2. I think you guys even showed it in the doc at one point, just like, that how crazy and hype, quote unquote, that whole scene and that whole community can get. Like it was just a fun thing to just be like, yeah, this was dope. This was cool back in the day, and that was fun like that. And just seeing the whole story play out, I thought it was really, really dope. But any other final closing thoughts, Kurt or Irene, about making the doc, they're talking about it now, years later. I mean, anything stand out to you? Anything that y'all want to say?
5 years later, I mean, it's funny. We watched it earlier this year, did like a live streaming event. It was the first time we'd watched it in a long time. I'm just kind of curious to you guys, watching that stuff unfolding. It's from 2000. I mean, some of that footage is like 10 years old at this point. Does it feel like a long time ago watching that stuff unfold? Does it seem like a different time?
Talking about it now, yes. Talking about it now, you date yourself because it's like, wow, Street Fighter 4 was mad long ago. Like that was one of the vibes I got. But it was a funny thing to kind of poke fun at myself. It's like, wow, I've been able to live through some of this stuff, which is cool.
I mean, that was the beginning. I mean, we captured the beginning of Twitch, really.
Yeah.
When Team we started live streaming.
Right.
There's footage.
It was TV at the time, right? Like, I think at one point when you guys were filming that stuff.
Yeah, I think he even set up in Chinatown Fair. We didn't get any good footage of that, but I remember seeing it. I mean, that was like the first.
Yeah.
And that's something that's like ubiquitous now, right? I mean, that's like.
What you guys did too? You guys, I think, caught some of the very beginnings of commentary on matches, especially competition. I think that's a very big deal for the fighting game community specifically.
Yeah, dude, totally. Like that, you're right. Like towards the end of the movie and Next Level. I mean, that was what was amazing. And looking back now, I realize that it really was the beginning of the future of home, of streaming with real commentary, treating it like a real thing. That technology was amazing because we saw it bringing in people from the suburbs or Long Island. They would drive in on a Friday after school or after work because they would watch live streams and be like, "Yo, I got to go to next level." So it's cool that we were there to witness the beginning of that. It was blowing us away.
Same thing for you, Irene. I mean, any other final thoughts? Thinking about looking back on it 5 years.
You're making me miss it.
Yeah, I'm just like, especially like during the pandemic when we can't like be together. I'm like, oh God, it just makes me, in talking about this, I'm like, I hope that there is a future for arcades to exist, or just, game lounges or whatever for gamers to come together and have those human experiences that are like just really important and see what you can't get online. So I really hope there's a future for that. Yeah.
Awesome.
That's my final thought.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah. lot of fun stuff, especially now with everything going on. Just it's one of those things you look back on. It's like, yeah, that was cool. I want more of that. Like those were some fun times. Like it was dope. But either way, hopefully all of you watching this now had a fun time hearing our discussion about the Lost Arcade, about Chinatown Fair. You could check out the Lost Arcade documentary now on Amazon Prime. It's right there right now. People can go stream it. People can go check it out and stuff. Do watch parties and the whole shebang. Any other stuff if you guys want to ask us, you can probably find all of us on social media. Where can everybody find you guys? Let's start off with Joe. You're at ScarletSprites, correct? Where are you
on
at now?
On Twitter and also YouTube. Yep.
Okay. Kern and Irene, where can everybody find you guys?
Yeah, we got the Lost Arcade on Facebook. We got a page there. You can hit us up, and yeah, that's probably the best place.
Yeah, tell them how much you guys like the doc, or ask them any questions that you guys have about even back then, or just any of the stuff that was shown in the documentary. But again, thank you so much for watching this panel. Hopefully you guys are enjoying UPLINK, and we will talk to all of you again very soon.